Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Gay with God podcast, a safe place for us to share our stories and support one another. How long did we know? What challenges did we face? Did we lose our faith? When did we find our way back home? Or are we still searching? The stories you hear on this podcast will melt your heart and strengthen your belief that in God, all things are possible, and you can be authentically gay with the God of your understanding. I am your host, Midge Noble, and I am very honored that you are here. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Gay with God podcast. I am your host, Midge Noble, and today we're going to talk about standing on the rock. Now, there's a little story that I want to give to you at the beginning of this episode, and it is a real story that happened many years ago while my beloved and I had found some property that we were going to build our retirement home. I had always wanted a log cabin, and I couldn't wait to live in the mountains and go back to what I felt like was always my roots. I loved the mountains as a child. My paternal grandparents, Mama and Papa, had a cabin up on our church's, like the denominational church camp. And for the longest time after he retired as a preacher, he was their manager up there for the campground. He would, bring in the people and they would pay and they would stay. And they had this little cabin and he would mow all the grounds. And he also did a little radio show about the end times. Yes, he was a hellfire and brimstone preacher, and so a little bit scary about that. But anyway, he loved that cabin, and Mama loved being up there, and it really, I think, was part of their end-of-life story when their sons, for their betterment and for their health and safety, moved them off the mountain. And it wasn't long before they started having health problems and illnesses, and then they passed away. And so when I was getting the chance to go back to my, soul roots, as I call it, I was thrilled to be able to think about retiring there. Now, as I speak to you now, I am not officially retired, and neither is my wife. And so we still sort of, jump back and forth between the home that we have here that's paid off, but we're also continuing to pay. We will probably always, until the last breath I take, be paying for this very small cabin that used to be, in our minds, an entire log home. And we were looking at all these great plans with high, lofty fireplace rocks and all this stuff. And as we continued to price those things, we're like, no, we'll have to scale that back a lot. And so we did. We scaled it back. It's 700 square feet. It does have some a private room downstairs for guests because of the slope of the land. We had to have a basement. And so our builder wisely told us it would be cheaper to go ahead and do a room downstairs instead of some sort of a loft upstairs for guests. And it would be more private for them, and it would be cheaper. And whenever I heard the word cheaper, I was like, yes, let's do that. So anyway, in the beginning, we camped there for probably, I don't know, 5 years before we ever started to build. We needed to pay off the land, and we wanted to do some early improvements to the property before we actually built. When we did decide to build, and we had this little 700 square foot cabin picked out, and we were so excited. The view was going to be amazing. Just word to the wise, if you ever do build somewhere like in the mountains, and they had logged the property ahead of time, so we had this great view. Well, trees do grow, FYI, and it can get out of control, and your view does diminish during leaf season. So anyway, just that's an aside. So we had this thing all mapped out. We met with the builder. We looked at the views. We looked at where we wanted it. We talked about positioning. He staked it out as to where we wanted to build. Now, in the mountains, when you build, in this particular North Carolina area, there are rules about building in the mountains and what has to happen. And in the clause of building and excavating and digging out your foundation, if you hit a rock, they have in all the contracts, there's a rock clause. And if they hit a rock that they can't move without, some of their equipment, they would have to blast out this rock to be able to go down into the earth and put in the foundation for the cabin. And so he said at the time, the builder did, that, if we did hit a rock, then we would have to pay $5,000 to $7,000, if they're blasting that out of there. And I wasn't ever quite sure if that was per blast or if that was just like the total thing. They might have said, but in my Aries brain, I don't retain things, and sometimes I just don't hear things that I don't want to hear, which is not good. But anyway, so one day I'm sitting in my office. I was a therapist for family and children at that time, and I was sitting there and I get a phone call from the builder. And he says, "Well, we've hit a rock and we can't move it. It's probably part of the bedrock. We can't move it. We're going to have to blast in order to get the back wall foundation in." And I said, this was on a Thursday, and I said, "No, don't do that." I said, "We'll come up this weekend. Just stop working. Don't do anything else. Let us come up and take a look at it and see what's happening." So we went up there on that Saturday, and the way the driveway, which had been a logging road, the logging road was still available, and so we were able to use that as our driveway with some improvements, but we were able to use that. And if everything was according to plan, the way we mapped out the cabin, we would come up this driveway and we would be able to park, a vehicle right behind the cabin. And then there should have been also enough space around that area somewhere to be parking other cars. So when we were coming up the logging road this day, we came up and we were about to run. As we got up to the top, we were going to run into where they were digging or trying to dig. And so we knew that they had moved that line back probably at least 5 to 7 feet, maybe 10. And so we're like, "No, that's not right." And he tried to justify it with, the view, and he tried to justify it with this and that. And I was about to, I'm an Aries. I get a little bit hot. I don't like to be disrespected. And I kept saying, "No, that's not right." And my wife finally said, "Give me a minute." And she walked away. And the builder goes, "Do I need to follow her?" And I said, "I wouldn't." I wouldn't. Just let her be. She's got to think this through. And he says, "Well, there's no other way to do it." And I said, "Let's just give her a moment. Give her a moment." And so she comes back. And later I find out that her dad, who had passed, a year or so before that, and he was a wonderful, intelligent man. He did a lot of drafting. He also did house inspections. He knew a lot about footers and all these things and how it should go. And she just kind of tried to, be quiet for a moment and just kind of consider with her father what he would tell her. And, she played things through in her head, and she really felt the presence of her dad there saying, "Don't settle. Don't settle." And so she came back and she goes, "No, we're not going to do this. You need to move this in to the original spot and dig there." And he goes, "Well, I'm pretty sure we're still going to find, rock there, and the same thing's going to apply." And she said, "There's not going to be any rock." He said, "Well, if we do that, then we're going to have to tilt the cabin just a little bit." And she goes, "That's fine, but you're not going to be back here. You're going to go up at least 5 feet." And so that was going to get it back to the original place or close to the original place. And then we'd still be able to come up and park behind the cabin, and all was going to be well, according to my very smart beloved and the spirit of her father. And so that's what they did. And there was no rock. And there was no rock on the other side where they thought they would hit rock if they tilted it to where they needed to tilt it. And we now, after all these many years, probably 13, 14 years, we've been in that cabin and it's still standing strong. like I said, the view is a little bit hampered during leaf season, but it's still a place where we find deep sacred respite, and it's always been a place of integrity. We've never taken more off of the land than we needed to. We were grateful that it was already logged before we got there, so that there are deer that and turkeys and apparently one day we saw skunks many years ago when we were camping, and we're so grateful that the corgis did not get sprayed because they were right on its butt. Um, so we have such a great wildlife up there, and they still have the run of the land. We coexist as best we can with each animal that comes along, and I'm just grateful. I'm so grateful that not only did we find a property that really does have a lot of rock in it, and it does sustain us. I do believe that it's helped keep the driveway in better order because a lot of it is still some of the bedrock, and we have gravel, which is often covered by grass during the summertime, but we noticed that the rabbits and the deer ate the grass, and we did not ever want to put anything toxic down anyway because of our dogs. And then when I realized that they were also eating the grass when we were battling all of this grass on the driveway, I just said, well, it looks like an English countryside drive. I mean, it's it's beautiful, it's wonderful. Best grass that we have in our whole entire yard is on the driveway during the summertime. But it's a way to honor who was there before us and who needs to still be respected. So when I talk today about standing on the rock, there there are some things that came to my mind just this past week as I'm preparing for a sermon that I'm going to preach on this Wednesday at the healing service. And the saint of the day is Argula von Grumbach. And I think that as a community that we right now need to learn how to advocate and stand boldly, speak wisely, and be unashamed to stand up for Jesus's gospel. To be gay with God, we have to have a voice still present today that people can rely on. When we're all speaking from the same voice of love and strength, then we are going to be listened to. Jesus never minced words, and Argula did not mince words either. She was born in 1492, and she came from a pretty rich, noble family in the Bavarian countryside. She was the first published Protestant woman, and she participated publicly in the theological and political debates of her time. Her father had given her a very expensive gift for one of her birthdays. It was a copy of the German Bible, and she absolutely loved it. And she continued her education as a lady in waiting at the court in a time when Renaissance and Reform were starting to stir in the air in Munich and Germany. She was 17 years old when her parents died, and she married 1 year later at the age of 18 and moved to the countryside in a little country town, and she was the one who took over and managed the household, finances, and the land. And the children that she had 4 children, and she, of course, took care of them and raised them while still pursuing her interests in theology. Publicly, she kind of stepped into her own strength in September of 1523. She learned that a Lutheran tutor had to recant his beliefs in public, and he didn't have to be burned at the stake, which apparently was a thing for that, but was exiled and imprisoned. And Argula wrote a letter to the clerics accusing them of, quote, foolish violence against the word of God, unquote, and continued, quote, nowhere in the Bible do I find that Christ or his apostles or his prophets put people in prison, burnt or murdered them, or sent them into exile. And I thought, wow, we're dealing with that now with Alligator Alcatraz. the concentration camp, the internment camp, basically, is what we need to start calling it, because they are not burning people, but they are definitely treating them with such disrespect and putting them in deplorable conditions, and they are creating just emotional violence toward families and children who are watching their parents be taken and put in places that nobody knows where they are, basically kidnapping them and taking them to parts unknown. So when I thought about how she spoke about that, there is nowhere in the Bible that condones that from Jesus's teachings. And it is important for us to remember as Christians that we have to stand on the side of Jesus's words, not a regime that is looking to be not only a fascist country, but not treating people with the respect that all people deserve. Argula wasn't done, though. She continued to advocate, and despite her being a lay person and a woman, she says she is compelled to speak by her divine duty as a Christian, to confess God's name. She quoted Matthew 10, if you want to look that up, and to be unashamed of Christ, Luke 9. Her knowledge of Scripture and her artful use of it was striking to the readers of her time, and it is striking now. I'm getting some of this information from the Lesser Feasts and Fasts, edition 2022, that talks about all of our saints. So it was so important for her to speak up because it did something in her soul. It stirred something in her soul, and she wanted to speak out. And what we can learn from her is that we do have to be bold. We do have to speak wisely. We do have to be unashamed to stand with Jesus's gospel. For those of you who are paying attention, yes, I know I repeated that, but I thought it was important because when we speak in love, people will listen. And maybe not the first time, maybe not the second, third, 10th, or 12th time, but if we continue to stand with integrity and we speak wisely and we come from a place of love, people will begin to assimilate that. They say that people need 7 times of repetition to hear what you're saying or to know, to remember what's being said. So we need to just keep speaking. And that's what they're doing. The other side is saying this rhetoric over and over and over. We can all write a manifest as to what their speaking points are because they're indoctrinating us with the same thing. So if they can indoctrinate our minds with this negative and deceitful rhetoric, we can certainly bring the truth of the gospel and continue to repeat, rinse, repeat, and give it to them from love, from a place of love. So the last paragraph in this writing about Argula von Grumbach says that she closes her letter by saying, "What I have written to you is no woman's chit-chat." Love that. This is no woman's chit-chat, but the word of God. And I write as a member of the Christian Church against which the gates of hell cannot prevail. Her letter was immediately printed as a pamphlet, which was then reprinted in 14 editions over 2 months. More pamphlets, letters, and poems followed, and consequences followed too. However, she did not seem ever to regret that she, like her forebearers, Judith, Esther, and Jael, had been called by God into decisive action. So that's relevant today. That's really super relevant today. And the other thing that is relevant is standing on the rock. When we stand on the rock, we are standing with Christ. We're standing with the God of our understanding, and we are the chosen ones to listen to the words that Jesus spoke. Jesus wants us to be obedient. The bottom line is that when we stand on the rock, that we're paying attention to how we can survive, because the whole story in Matthew 7:24 through 29 talks about building that house either on the rock or the sand. Now, If we had built somewhere else on the mountain and we did not build in that rocky situation, it would have been a totally different story when the heavy rains and the hurricanes come through there. We have high winds, we have lots of shifting sand up there in some places, but we found a property that has a pretty strong rock bed. And no, you don't want to pay $5,000, $7,000 to blast that rock out and build your house, but we were close enough to it that it's not going to be coming out from behind us. The sand is not going to be coming out from behind us because we are up against that rock. So it's important to remember that not only are we being called to speak the truth and speak up, we're being called to an obedience for our own salvation and our own life. So in that story is all about God reminding us that we need to follow God's word in order to have the life we want. Is it going to be one without peril or calamity? No. But just like Argula found out, and just like many of the people in the Bible found out, it goes a lot better if you're going ahead and listening for instructions and following them than doing it by yourself. It's sort of like trying to put something together without the pamphlet. Just because you think you know how all the bolts and the screws go on and how it's going to work out, it's really important to look at the instruction manual. And that's sort of what the Bible is all about, is an instruction manual on how everybody screwed up, how everybody tried to do it by themselves, how everybody had an ego, and believed in things that were going to wash away, instead of believing in what Jesus always taught us, to be obedient, to listen to how to treat people, to love one another, to not hurt people on purpose, and to be able to ask for forgiveness when you've done wrong. Those messages are all through the Bible. And as Jesus, is quoted in Matthew, it was all the way back through the Old Testament. Leviticus is all about the laws and obedience. Not that we follow every single one of them now, but it's important to remember where they came from and why they were there. And it really was for the health and safety of all of the people that were going through all of those challenging times, that those Levitical rabbinic laws were important to stay healthy and to stay alive. The Bible also talks about, how people will be blessed for their obedience and what could happen if they're disobedient. There's a rabbinic parable in Psalm that talks about building a house on stones. So, even back then in the Old Testament, this message was continuing to evolve then for Jesus to give this parable in Matthew 7. So when you look at the Bible from the Old Testament to the New Testament, as we've said before, Jesus always goes back and will reference some rabbinic teaching or law in his parables or in the things that he talks about in the New Testament. So when we are able to pay attention to what is obedience, and obedience is not going along with an antichrist. You follow the God of your understanding. You follow the teachings of Jesus. You follow love. And if you do that, you're going to not only be on the right side of history, but you're going to be on solid rock. And whether you have trials or tribulations or health concerns, your salvation is in the books. My beloveds, speak with love and strength. Be bold. Speak wisely. Be unashamed to stand with Jesus. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for sharing, subscribing, and being a part of this community. I really appreciate you so very much. Check out our Facebook group, Gay with God, where we do a monthly Zoom group entitled My Faith Journey. When you go to Facebook and you look up Gay with God Facebook page, answer all the questions so that you can be invited inside. If you need support to help you through your coming out or faith journey, go to the show page at empoweredmidge.podbean.com, scroll all the way down to the bottom and see how you can connect with me for a free confidential complimentary session. You can also find that link at the bottom of every episode. Connect with Midge. I have links there for getting your complimentary session with me, and also links for my memoir, Gay with God, Reclaiming My Faith, Honoring My Story. If you want a signed copy of the memoir, go to gaywithgod.com, my website, gaywithgod.com, and you can buy it there. If you are listening to this podcast and are questioning whether you can be gay and be in a relationship with the God of your understanding, if you identify as LGBTQIA+, are not even sure if you are gay, God has always been within you. Even when you didn't know it, you have always been gay with God. Thank you, everybody. Stay tuned to see how you can join the Gay with God community. And as always, you are loved. I want to invite you to become a part of the Gay with God community. How can you do that? Stay connected by messaging me your thoughts and comments in the comment section under the downloads of the show on the Gay with God show page. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen and share so we can increase our community outreach and be a light to those who are struggling to claim their faith. Consider being a sponsor so I can highlight your service in our community. We are all worthy of respect and a relationship with the God of our understanding. I want to thank you in advance for supporting this podcast. Together, we as a community will keep this show visible and our community stronger. Deep gratitude to my friend Tim McClendon of Tim McClendon Music for allowing me to use an excerpt from Interlude 4, a song found on his CD entitled Sundance.